At least as early as 1960, Elizabeth Anscombe made arguments drawing on thought about things that are necessary, in the sense that without them some good cannot be or come about, or some evil be expelled or avoided. She drew this sense of the term necessary from Book 5 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, what she called Aristotle's Dictionary. And she later described the source passage from Aristotle as a pregnant remark. In the early paper, her midwifery drew from the pregnant remark her thought about moral authority. Quote, the authority to declare to someone else what is true, in this case what is right and what is wrong, and to demand that he accept what one says and act accordingly, close quote. It informed her discussion of the authority of the state, where again, authority is, as she puts it, quote, a regular right to be obeyed in a domain of decision, close quote. More generally, this thought underwrites her account of rights and her accounts of rules. Both turn on how some possibilities of good are created and then made actual through our understanding, deployment, and obedience to the dictates of what she named stopping modals. She writes, quote, I want to arouse interest in what I'll call stopping modals. These are, of course, negative. Corresponding positive ones we may call forcing modals. The negative gets priority. It is, I think, more frequent than the positive, which restricts one's action to one thing, just as thou shalt nots tend to leave you freer than thou shalts. She continues, quote, you have to and you can't are the first words used by one who is making you do something or preventing you, and they quickly become themselves instruments of getting and preventing action. After all, once this transformation has taken place, the following is true. In such a case, you are told you can't do something that you plainly can, as comes out in the fact that you sometimes do. At the beginning, the adults will physically stop the child from doing what they say he can't do, but gradually the child learns. Peter Winch was really disturbed by this sort of forceful image. With one set of circumstances, this business is part of the build-up of the concept of a rule. With another, of a piece of etiquette. With another, of a promise. In another, of an act of sacrilege or impiety. With another, of a right. It is part of human intelligence to be able to learn the responses to stopping modals, without which they wouldn't exist as linguistic instruments, and without which these things, rules, etiquette, rights, infringements, promises, pieties and impieties, would not exist either, close quote. By tying our capacity to operate with stopping modals to human intelligence and to what she at one point actually calls the practices of human reason, Anscombe links this capacity to operate with these to distinctively human good. Rules, rights, and the like are linguistic instruments caught up in making possible such things as economic and legal systems, the moral education of children, peaceful modes of conflict resolution, good manners, and so on. In this sense, the capacity to use, understand, and follow the strictures at issue in stopping modals is, as Peter Winch put it, quote, humanly necessary, close quote. Anscombe's development of Aristotle's remark may be one of the most important aspects of her legacy in contemporary Anglophone moral philosophy. For, while Anscombe used her work on these topics in support of David Hume's famous observation that both the existence of such things as promises and the obligation to do one's word were naturally unintelligible, an anti-Humean form of contemporary ethical naturalism draws some of its inspiration, sustenance, and direction from Anscombe's work on this topic, a topic that Philippa Foot named Aristotelian necessity. Foot's work on natural goodness grows from this strand of Anscombe's thought, and some of Michael Thompson's work, to which Foot owes a special debt, can be read as a concerted effort to provide a more detailed, more thoroughly articulated, more advanced, and more clearly defended version of this strand of Anscombe's practical philosophy. At the center of Anscombe-inflected neo-Aristotelian naturalism is the thought that we can account for a great deal of ethics by thinking about what is needful in human life generally. When we think about practices like promising, virtues like justice or courage, and institutions that serve to produce, maintain, and help to reproduce well-ordered social life, we can make some headway in understanding both our specific topic and its logos or ratio if we consider the sense in which our topic, makes some forms of human good possible, and even, in some cases, actualizes the very good made possible thereby. It is against the backdrop of thought about human life and what is good for the human as such that claims about Aristotelian necessity get some traction in this region of contemporary Anglophone practical philosophy. Now I will I will focus on Anscombe. I'll start by trying to disentangle different ways in which thought about Aristotelian necessity informs her practical philosophical writings, with special emphasis on her treatment of stopping modals. On the face of it, at least, very different kinds of negative considerations count as belonging to the sphere of Aristotelian necessity, according to Anscombe. I'll try to say something about what these have in common. Having tried to isolate what her varied examples share, I will consider how thought about human good gets caught up in discussion of stopping modals. Finally, I'll turn to cases where she thinks that appeal to what is generally needful in human life fails to help us understand the point or force of a family of key ethical considerations, even as she holds fast to the idea that the sphere of the ethical is the sphere of distinctively human life and distinctively human good. Now, Aristotelian necessity is a fairly broad topic, as Anscombe understands it. She gives a wide range of examples of stopping modals that express Aristotelian necessity. Among them, you can't wear that, and you have to move your king. Unlike Aristotle's examples of needing to take a drug to relieve physical distress or needing to sail to Aegina to collect a sum of money, the special subclass of interest to Anscombe seem to have at least three distinctive features. First, the justification for you can't do such and such or you have to do such and such does not involve mention of any additional fact in support of the prohibition or the prescription. If you can't do such and such because it is ends to do, hence you have to let n do such and such instead, this expresses n's right or obligation. I mean, that's what you're saying. And Anscombe argues, the right or obligation is partly constituted by the fact that it is not anyone else's place to do the thing in question. There's all kinds of examples. Rendering the marriage debt would be a clean one. ends right or obligation is not an independent fact that can be adduced in support of the prescription or prohibition. Rather, the prohibition and prescription are joint aspects of ends right or obligation. They all hang together. Second, the because clauses that one might attach to the prescription or prohibition, in this case, because N is the only one who has a right or obligation to do such and such, do not provide extra reasons to do or forbear doing the thing in question. Instead, Anscombe argues, they help to classify or thematize the stopping modal and enforcing modal pair. The stuff of the because clause is, in the same sense, dependent. Anscombe writes, quote, "Let me now restrict the word reason in the context of action to something independent which someone puts forward as his reason for what he does. And let me adopt the word logos, I might also use theme, for the second half of you can't because ... where the two halves are not independent. I shall sorry. I'm getting over a nasty cold. I shall say that there are various logos types, and that the name of the general logos type is an abstraction from many particular cases, a label which tells you the formal character of the stopping modal." It's the second thing they all have in common. Third, learning to deploy and abide by stopping modals of a logos type is learning both the concepts associated with the logos type and the practical orientation that actualizes the relevant logoi. The typical way in which this happens is through social interaction standardly governed in accordance with the relevant logoi. Recall Anscombe's remark about how this moral education works. Quote, "With one set of circumstances, this business is part of the buildup of the concept of a rule, with another of a piece of etiquette, with another of a promise, in another of an act of sacrilege or impiety, with another of a right." I take it that her list is a sample list of logos types. Compare, quote, "One does not learn morality by learning that certain propositions, ethical ones, are true, but by learning what to do or abstain from in particular situations, and getting by practice to do certain things and abstain from others." Okay, how does her work on stopping modals connect to the ways in which philosophers like Foote and Rosalind Hursthouse turn to thought about human nature to illuminate work on virtue, on human flourishing, on happiness, and on a host of other ethical concepts? Recall that Anscombe remarked that the practical education at issue in deploying and abiding by stopping modals counted as an actualization of basic human capacities, that it was a part of human intelligence to be able to learn the responses to stopping modals. We are the chatty animals, the rational ones. Anscombe takes a step in the direction of more recent extensions of her work, precisely by linking her exploration of stopping and forcing modal pairs to thought about discursive human reason. And her specific discussions of rules and rights in general, and in the context of her discussions of authority, in more particular instances, make direct reference to common human good, to what's generally needful in human life, in a way echoed by more recent neo-Aristotelian work. For instance, when invited to locate the source of the obligation to do one's word, the sense in which I do not merely risk being reproached if I, break a promise, but deserving reproach, Anscombe points out that it's generally needful in human life to get other people to do things, and that this need dramatically outstrips anyone's capacity to get others to do his will because they love him or fear him. Quote, thus, she writes, such a procedure as promising is an instrument whose use is part and parcel of an enormous amount of human activity and hence of human good, of the supplying of both human needs and human wants, so far as the satisfaction of these are possible. It is scarcely possible to live in a society without encountering it and even being involved in it, close quote. Of moral authority, she writes, the authority to declare what is right or wrong, virtuous or vicious, however distasteful it may be, is a sort of authority that can hardly be denied to exist by even the most recalcitrant moral philosopher, for it is exercised by people in bringing up children. And if there is such a thing as authority of a commanding kind at all, or if there is such a thing as a right, this authority and this right can hardly be denied, since it is quite necessary, if children are to be brought up, that their bringers up act as if they were exercising such authority. And since what is a necessity can hardly fail to be a right, so anyone who wants to bring children up must have this right, close quote. It's humanly necessary that there be this right in order to bring up children, and it's humanly necessary that we bring up children. By a similar token in her discussion of the authority of the state, she argues that the right of government to back up its strictures with coercive force, although it must have some standing in custom, cannot be merely a customary right. She argues that people in general need protection against violence and also protection in law against violation of their customary rights, partly because we're vulnerable to personal violence and partly because customary rights can clash. We need a higher authority to look after it, protect us, and to settle disputes that arise when customs are in conflict. Okay. The sort of justification that she's providing for general items like rights or rules or practices or institutions in all of this stuff is, I take it, instrumental. That's what she likes about Aristotelian necessity. She thinks that it gives us a way of arguing for a right without appeal to custom or law or contract, because we're lodging it in what's needful for human good, right? And also of arguing that and also of arguing that some customary rights aren't actually customary rights, but are instead customary wrongs. So she thinks that Aristotelian necessity, thought about it, gives us some critical leverage in cases where things are going badly. Now, but it's as instruments, ways of making things possible, ways of doing things, ways of bringing about good, that she thinks you can get some justification here. I think that you can quarrel with Anscombe's justification of the state noticing, for instance, that the reach of the modern state dramatically exceeds the reach of, say, Lockean umpire state, which is what it sometimes sounds like she's describing. I think we can doubt the extent of the authority that bringers up of children actually need or have. We can notice that Anscombe does not argue that individual people will tend in general to go along with any of it. Even if the justification for the relevant forms of obedience rest in what's humanly needful. In short, I think you can raise a number of concerns about her substantive use of thought about what humans need in general and about the justifications that she's giving. But the basic form of the argument she develops in these specific contexts has been, I think, undeniably attractive to many philosophers working in contemporary neo-Aristotelian ethics. And while I don't actually think that she should accept every development of this line of thought, I think it's, for better or worse, her teaching has inspired an entire school of contemporary Anglophone moral philosophy. Okay. I'm so sorry. Okay. That's part of the reason that I want now to have a look at her sense of the points where thought about Aristotelian necessity fails to illuminate crucial aspects of the ethical. In a recent essay directed primarily to Foote's account of natural goodness, Anscombe traces out Anscombe's concern about attempting to rely upon thought about Aristotelian necessity to capture the whole of morality. Müller stresses that the kind of justification that Anscombe offers for general items, like rights, institutions, rules, and so on, is fundamentally instrumental in character. The good or point of the virtues, rules, rights, institutions, and social practices that Anscombe finds in appeals to what is generally needful sees the objects thereby justified as instruments for satisfying these general needs, as ways of promoting or actualizing human good. The justifications are, in a peculiar sense, utilitarian, although the beneficiary of the good in question is not, in the first instance, an individual or a group of individuals or a mass of human individuals. The good in question is, in a special sense, common good, where common good need not be the good of any arbitrarily large collection of individual human beings. She's got enough Wittgensteinian scruples in her to not be very happy about metaphysics, but there's definitely a metaphysical picture of human nature here and what will count as human flourishing. And I think that the commonality of the common good is tied to that understanding. It's not empiricist or biological. Thompson goes on and on about this, but it's a sense. Okay. On Müller's reading, Foote attempts to use Anscombe-style thought about Aristotelian necessity to reach all the way down to particular individuals facing particular circumstances, making particular choices. This is, he thinks, why Foote seems to take it that a why should I be moral question ceases to arise on her understanding of natural goodness. Because Foote ties morality explicitly to rationality, a why be moral question in the land of Foote looks as though it's something on the order of a why be rational question. And there are well-known arguments to the effect that it is very hard to see how such a question ever could be given a sensible answer. What are you asking for? A reason? Like, why be rational? Although Anscombe explicitly links her discussion of stopping modals and forcing modals to general concern over human reason, she does not take this extra step. More than this, she comes to reject the suggestion that virtues and their exercise can be grounded in thought about what is humanly needful. Miller puts the point this way. Quote, Anscombe came to argue that not all virtue can be understood as serving our well-being, or rather, since virtue belongs to the human form of life, so that all virtuous conduct is part of our well-being, that some of virtue's requirements can be said to serve a good human life. I mean, because of all that some of virtue's requirements can be said to serve a good and human life only in the sense that satisfaction of these requirements is an ingredient, not an instrument of human good. So he's seeing that Anscombe is more inclined to align practice of virtue with human good in a way that prevents you from being able to make an external appeal to human good in support of the virtue. Where a virtuous practice cannot count as virtuous because it serves an aspect of human well-being other than the practice itself, we can't explain its goodness in terms of Aristotelian necessity. Now, Anscombe argued that central aspects, it gets worse. Anscombe argued that central aspects of virtue, for example, refusing to engage in murder as a means to some other end or an end in itself, could not be understood in terms of Aristotelian necessity. And I think that Miller's gloss on her complaint against Foote's strategy holds here as well. Her writing, I don't know, I work on her so much that I kind of love her, but I appreciate how frustrating she can be. Her writing on the topic, of course, takes a less direct tack. She doesn't pull out here and say, look, it's an ingredient. How can it be a separate, independent justification? She writes, if someone, given that in a case of murder, the one wronged in the first instance would be the victim, like the dead guy, she writes, quote, if someone is wronged, he has a right which is violated. But the wrongfulness of murder seems to be the basis of the right rather than vice versa. Because A, there is not a simple right to life, but rather a right not to be murdered. And B, if there were a certain right to life, upon which the wrongfulness of murder is based, it would be difficult to see why it should not be waivable. The prohibition on murder is indeed a great charter right to all of us, but it is the prohibition that comes first and not the right. She's thinking partly because there are all kinds of cases where we countenance killing, so it's not a simple matter of there being just a right to life that human beings have. She thinks that the right that human beings have is actually the right not to be murdered, which is kind of great. Okay. Now, she goes on to suggest that the aspect of human nature at issue in the Prohibition on murder is something on the order of the spiritual nature of human beings, and that this is a source of what you could call supra-utilitarian value. It's non-instrumental, it's there. And there are other writings, her later writings, where she brings together this thought with specifically theological concerns about our ultimate end. We come from God, if all goes well, like beacons, we're heading toward God the whole time. Such a being, I mean, she does connect these remarks to thought about human dignity, and the dignity of human life. I think the better term would probably be sanctity. She's thinking about the sanctity of human life here. I think that we don't have to be willing to follow her that far. But I think she does supply us with some grounds to be suspicious of the general extension of her thought about Aristotelian necessity to try to cover the whole field of morality. Thank you.